So people make a lot about the claim that the four gospels, the canonical gospels in the New Testament, are anonymous works because the authors never name themselves or give themselves a name within the body of the text. And people like Muslims and other people, they draw a lot of erroneous conclusions from a statement like that because it can be misleading. Here we see in the Gospel of John, the author does in fact identify himself as one of the 12 apostles and therefore an eyewitness of these things. At the end of John's Gospel in chapter 21, verse 24, it says, "This is the disciple which testifieth of these things and wrote these things, and we know his testimony is true." And so when he says, "This is the disciple which testifieth of these things," he's identifying himself as the disciple. Which disciple is that? Well, it's the disciple whom Jesus loved. And then you see that I mentioned in John chapter 13, and here again in chapter 21, a disciple which is identified as the one that Jesus loved. And in 21:24 says, "This is the disciple which testifieth of these things." And wrote these things. So the author here is definitely being identified in the end of John chapter 21. So that alone should tell you just internally that John is claiming to be an eyewitness. But even if that is not sufficient for you to see that he's claiming to be an eyewitness, if you go to 1 John, it is clear in 1 John, you see the author again identify himself as an eyewitness. And how do we know that 1 John is the same author as the Gospel of John? Well, you can look at the vocabulary and the style that's used. You can actually see it in English. So that which was from the beginning. So if you remember how John 1:1, the Gospel of John 1:1 opens up as, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." If you look at 1 John 1:1, that which was from the beginning, and then which we have looked upon and our hands have handled. So you have, and we have seen with our own eyes. So you have the eyewitness testimony being attested to. But then you have the word of life. So if you look at just in Greek there, this is the same, that which was, it's the same verb as John 1:1, ap archis, from the beginning. So you have the same in the beginning, or the same kind of opening style as John 1:1. And you have in John 1:1, you have the logos, which here the word logu, tis zois, of life. You have life, you have beginning, you have this imperfect tense in being used. And then you also have in the very next verse in pros ton patera. So you have which was with the Father. This is exactly like what you see in John 1:1. In pros ton theon, instead of patera, Father, it says theon, God, which was with God. In 1 John 1:2, I should say, you have was with the Father. And so it's clear that the person writing this is keying in on the exact same vocabulary. He's structuring his letter the same way in this big opening statement about that which was from the beginning, and he's giving testimony that he's an eyewitness. And so you can see evidence just from the vocabulary is being used and the exact word choice, that this is very, very similar in style to what you find in the Gospel of John. Again, that which we have seen and heard declare we unto you. Now, that is just in the first chapter, but it continues on where you have this similarity in vocabulary. common vocabulary between the two letters, that not only in the Gospel of John is he claiming to be an eyewitness, First John also claims to be an eyewitness, and they are traditionally attested to as the same authorship between the two. And we see here that the only possible way that this is not the same person is if someone is trying to forge a letter in the style of John. So you have here big emphasis on eternal life, big emphasis on believe in the name of the Son, Jesus Christ. Yeah, so 1 John 4:9. In this was manifested the love of God toward us, because that God sent his only begotten Son into the world that we might live through him. This verse will sound extremely familiar if you're familiar with John 3:16. There's no way that someone is writing this letter in a way that is distinct or separate from, or in a different style from the author of John's gospel. Just compare that, right, to John. It's a very well-known verse, but John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. So you have all these carryovers in vocabulary, themes, words, and ideas, even, prepositional phrases and things like that, that they're the same author, and coupled with the fact that in 1 John, he is absolutely claiming to be an eyewitness. So when people say that, hey, the Gospels are anonymous works, therefore they're not the work of eyewitnesses. I have another video on Luke saying that he was an eyewitness to the events in the book of Acts, that he was a traveling companion with Paul. I highly recommend that video, which would have put him in fellowship with the 12 disciples and people who knew the 12 original apostles. And so he would, just as he claims to have, it would put him in access to eyewitness testimony for his Gospel of Luke. But then in John, he doesn't name himself by name, but just because he doesn't name himself doesn't mean he doesn't identify himself as an eyewitness. Even if at the closure of the Gospel of John, you don't accept that as being a claim to be an eyewitness, there's no mistaking that the opening of 1 John is a claim to be an eyewitness of the life and the events of Jesus Christ. So, a real short video talking about sort of the authorship and arguments about eyewitness testimony in the Gospels. In John is an eyewitness, and he claims to be within the New Testament. So that's short video. Hope you got something out of that. And I'll see you in the next one. God bless.